This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. On this program, we make it a point to focus our attention away from American politics because, well, the world doesn't revolve around us. But April brought stories unprecedented in American history. On April 4th, former President Donald Trump was charged with 34 counts of falsifying business records. It's the first time a president, former or sitting, has been indicted for a crime. In the weeks since, Trump appears more popular than ever, and he's pulled ahead of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the polls for the 2024 Republican nomination. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden officially announced he's running for re-election in 2024, and it's unclear if there's a strong challenger in the Democratic Party. Many Americans wish both candidates would retire, and yet a rematch of 2020 is not only possible, looks pretty likely unless the former president's legal troubles do him in. And adding to the frenetic month was Fox News settling a defamation lawsuit with Dominion Voting Systems for $787 million. And caught in the fallout was the embattled host and conspiracy peddler Tucker Carlson. Joining me to make sense of this recent political turmoil is Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic, lead writer for The Atlantic's daily newsletter. He's the author of several books, including The Death of Expertise, and his most recent, Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. Tom Nichols, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks, Ray. Good to be with you.
Well, elsewhere in this same edition of the program, we're talking to a Nigerian journalist about her country's terrible struggles with false news reports, viral conspiracy theories, the legitimate news business playing catch-up to the falsehood business. Should the U.S. be preparing for the same in 2024?
I think we're already there. I don't think it's a matter of preparing for it. We're in the middle of it. We are a country that is awash in conspiracy theories and intentional poisoning of the information stream. So it's not a matter of getting ready for it in a year or so. I think we've been in it for several years, and we're still kind of playing catch up and lagging behind.
People around the world are widely deceived, not only by their governments, but by falsehood peddlers. Nigeria's deeply divided society, regionally, ethnically, religiously. Has modern technology made it easier, or at least too easy, not to mention cheap, to exploit divisions in a society?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing that technology did was remove the gates that would prevent, for example, an editor. I mean, something as simple as an editor from saying, we need more sources on this story, or we need, a second. I mean, you're a journalist, you know the old drill. But now, if you can just go direct with a technology that allows you to publicly disseminate without having to buy newsprint or without having to buy ink, without having to buy airtime, you can just throw things out into the public square, like dumping a big barrel of trash, and kind of make everybody live with it. And, I suppose there are younger folks, I think, who would probably say it's great to get rid of the gatekeepers, information belongs to everybody. But that's not really how information works. For years, I would have students. I was a professor for 35 years before I did this. And, I would have students, say, but the internet's a big library. It's like the Library of Alexandria. No, it's a gigantic dumpster. And sometimes you'll find at the bottom of a dumpster, you might find a Rolex watch or a filet mignon, but mostly what you find in a dumpster is a lot of trash. And that's absolutely a matter of technology. But I'll add one other thing. Even in edited media, even in places that do have editors and fact checkers, and there are so much more bandwidth to fill that, Ray, you'll probably laugh because the origin of this expression. Some years ago, I had to explain to my students what an above-the-fold story meant.
Made you feel old in that.
Oh, boy, did it ever. I said, well, there were these things called newspapers, and there was only so much real estate inside the page, and that if a story was on the, upper quadrant that you would see when the newspaper was folded, that was the really important story. And the students just looked at me like I was talking about stone tablets or something. And because there's so much bandwidth, even the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Atlantic or Politico, Forbes, you name it, there's so much information there that it's almost beyond human capacity to keep up with it. And it's also hard to, because you're trying to fill so much space, it's also hard to make editorial decisions about, is this a story we wouldn't have even put in the newspaper 15 or 20 years ago? One of my very first jobs was at a newspaper where I did a small newspaper. I did everything from editing and writing to layout. And I remember, saying, we just don't have enough inches on a page for this particular story this week, and we might just let it go. Now there's almost no such thing as not having enough room for even the most trivial story.
Since you left the Naval War College and began this new job at the Atlantic as a staff writer, you've been pretty tough on, what should I call it, the political culture of the United States. Silly, shallow, feckless, obsessed with trivial matters. You've gone as far as to say that Americans are a less virtuous people. It's a pretty harsh indictment. But does that leave us more vulnerable to garbage information? Is a less virtuous people, it follows, less willing to do the work of figuring out what's real and what's not?
Oh, that's absolutely true. But let's not lay it off on my new job. I was writing stuff like this for
fair enough.
For years. I wrote Our Own Worst Enemy while I was still teaching at the Naval War College. And in it, I argued that, as I did in the book before it, The Death of Expertise, that we have become a fundamentally unserious and narcissistic people. And not just us. I mean, I think I expanded on this in Our Own Worst Enemy to say this is becoming a global problem, in part because of affluence and high living standards and very high levels of technology that, make things easy. The end of the Cold War, that kind of removed guardrails of seriousness around our political discussions. We don't have discussions about, hey, do we really want to trust this guy with the nuclear button? We just kind of say, oh, the Cold War's over. What's the big deal? We compete with China economically and so on. So yeah, I mean, I have made that argument, and I think it deprives us of the political antibodies in a way that help us to make decisions about what's serious. The New York Times or the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal shouldn't have to tell you that a war in the middle of Europe is more important than a Kardashian drama. But even if they didn't do that, you should be able to do that. You should be able to make those discriminations. And I think the problem is, in an unserious culture, in an unserious political culture, where everything is kind of LOL, right? Nothing really matters. We simply are suckers for what interests us rather than what we think is important.
There were stakes before. If we got things wrong, it really mattered.
I think I miss the days where people read. My parents were not educated people, but they were avid readers of newspapers. And you read the newspaper, even if it was boring. You read what was going on at City Hall in your hometown. People just won't do that now. Things have to be interesting and grab their eyeballs and make them feel like they're part of a drama. And that's, I think, really unhealthy because that creates a market for that stuff.
Throughout my career, we became more and more afraid of the audience and afraid of what it would do if we didn't keep them constantly stimulated and entertained. If we bored them for a second, it was feared, they would go away. And this forced us, I never totally trusted my bosses when they told me that we had to do this, but we had to treat them as if they were children. And now they're getting their revenge, I think.
Look at what's happened with Fox News. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting about the revelations in the Dominion lawsuit is the degree to which Fox regarded we now know, right, from watching their internal discussions, exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, that they not only feared their audience, but feared them with a certain streak of contempt. It's like, we just have to shovel this troll feed out the door because this is what our viewers want. And if we don't feed them this trash, they're going to go down the street to the next right-wing website or outlet that will feed it to them. And I think that's unfortunate. And it's part of the consumerizing of everything, the kind of commodification of everything. But it's also the problem of an uncivic culture that says, tell me the stuff that I want to hear, rather than saying, please inform me enough to be a better citizen and a better participant in my democracy.
Well, you've used the word narcissism, and I think that dovetails nicely with what you were just saying, because narcissism is literally an obsession with the self, a sense of entitlement, but along with that is kind of narcissism's always present evil twin, which is a lack of empathy. Not only are you engrossed with yourself, but it makes you unable to extend any love for, care for, worry about the fate of others. Has that kind of narcissism made even stopping digging, much less getting out of the hole that we're in, that much harder?
Oh, it's absolutely poisonous. And even if you don't have deep empathy in a democracy, narcissists, one of the things I said in the book was narcissists by definition cannot be members of a community, because the idea of a community simply doesn't compute to them. It's it's not that they reject it. It's just a word they don't understand. And so when you go into that voting booth with that very much, it's all about me and how is this going to affect me and how is this good for me? You don't even have to have empathy for other people who might be less fortunate. You're not even capable of stepping out of yourself and saying, look, what's good for my community? Who's the best person to fill the potholes? You can't even think of that. You really walk in. I think that the one line from the past 5 or 6 years that really jumped out at me was a woman who was laid off. She was furloughed during the government shutdown under then President Trump. And she apparently had voted for him. And she said, I'm not supporting him anymore. He's not hurting the people he's supposed to be hurting. That is an incredibly toxic attitude to take into the voting booth, to say, I'm not here to do what's right for the country. I'm not here to get the potholes fixed or to get city hall's, roof repaired. I'm here to vote for whoever is going to make me happy by hurting people that I don't like.
But what a wonderful self-revelatory, you have to credit her with toxic honesty, I guess. She
not a lot of self-awareness, but a lot of unintended candidness at that moment. Yeah.
Because really, it's a motif of our modern politics that you want to get the rageaholics all spun up by reassuring them that you hate the same people they hate.
Right. And that's how you build a community. You can say, well, we don't really like anybody, but we all agree on the people that we really hate. And when I wrote about this at length, I included a chapter on a study that had been done on a little Italian town in the 1950s that just kind of baffled sociologists. Why can't they get along? Why are they always poor? Why can't they just even cooperate long enough to farm a plot of land? And it was exactly this. It's like, I don't care about anybody except myself and my immediate family. And the only reason they vote was in this very transactional kind of what's good for me and who am I striking back at by doing this? And just as in American politics, you get these weird shifts of people saying, I want to vote for the guy, whoever the outsider is, who's going to talk to me and hurt other people. This is how you had people jumping back and forth between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, a few years back. It breaks down the entire concept of a civic and functional democracy if people just constantly walk in and saying, look, I'm just here to make a deal.
Recently, for the American Communities Project, I visited corners of the country wrestling with high rates of what are now called deaths of despair. Suicide, depression, drug and alcohol abuse, chronic untreated pain, sizable losses in life expectancy in local areas. Now, people listening to our conversation may think, oh, he's going to go back to the empathy thing. No, what was interesting about these places was that a lot of the people who live in them are convinced that no one gives a damn about them. That not only are they suffering in this way, which is terrible, these are grim places, but also they are convinced that their fellow Americans don't care about them. And I wonder how much of an engine of our current style of politics that conviction is, that no one cares about me.
Well, let me make two observations about deaths of despair. And the first one's going to be somewhat unkind, that some of that is projection, I would argue. No one cares about me because I don't care about anyone. So who would care about me? I don't care about anybody. There was a book some years ago, and maybe you remember it, called Dying of Whiteness by
Jonathan Metzl. Terrific.
Jonathan Metzl, right. And he talked to people who literally were dying, who said, well, the guy who needed a liver transplant, he said, well, if I have to get that through Obamacare, then I don't want it. I mean, determined to say, because that means that some other ne'er-do-well, in his mind anyway, some Mexican or some Black person, he said, if they're going to get it, then none of us get it, because that's not right. And they would rather die. And so when, in some of these areas, we say, well, nobody cares about us. Well, where is the sense of community there? But I want to say something else about deaths of despair, because you and I, of course, we know some of this in Western Massachusetts, where I'm from. You and I have seen some of these same communities. People don't think they exist in New England, but they do. And I always found it interesting that it wasn't until rural white Americans started having these problems that the political discourse started saying deaths of despair. When it was, the South Bronx and Chicago and kids dying of drugs and alcohol and guns and all that, it was, crime and dysfunction. And I kind of object to the deaths of despair framing sometimes, because it seems very much again, in this way that says in groups, out groups, my people, other people. You would never have heard, and I was a former Republican, as you know. I mean, you would never have heard Republicans in the 1970s saying, well, we have to do something about deaths of despair in South Chicago. That was never the framing. Now, when it's Ohio, well, now it's a national tragedy. Or when it's Cape Cod and it's heroin, well, now it's an epidemic that we have to treat like a public health problem. And I think that, again, reinforces this problem of saying, if it's somebody I know or somebody who's like me, then I care about it. That's not a civic environment.
Returning to your idea about civic virtue, the judge in the Donald Trump case in New York, the one brought by District Attorney Alvin Bragg, has been asked by the prosecution to restrain the former president from his pattern of attacks on prosecutors, judges, juries, saying that it's dangerous, that it is bad for the judicial system, and this would put the former president in danger of contempt charges, steep fines, and perhaps even being incarcerated pending trial. It's bad enough when any criminal defendant is excoriating the judge in public. It would seem to be even worse when someone who is the chief executive of the United States has to be disciplined by a judge not to cause disrepute or call disrepute on the entire judicial system. Is that an example of this erosion of virtue that you're talking about?
Oh my God. Donald Trump is the ultimate expression of this kind of national epidemic of narcissism. I mean, I guess to a certain extent, you have to be a little bit narcissistic to run for president, but sure. I think Trump's a dysfunctional sociopath. I really do. But what's really unfortunate about that is how many people are unable to step back from their attachment to Donald Trump and say, listen, I don't care who you are, and I don't care what your politics are. You don't threaten judges. I mean, even the mafia doesn't do that. Even the mafia, occasional moments, right, with gangbangers and maybe a few crazy mob guys over the decades. But, even John Gotti wasn't like putting out the word to go after judges because, there are things that you just don't do. And the idea that people can accept that now or can think even in those terms is almost alien to them, because it means that your team doesn't win. And you see this now even with people who are otherwise, they're not out of their minds, they're not unintelligent, but they say, well, yeah, but if Donald Trump runs again, I guess I'll have to vote for him because, the Democrats are communists. And they're like not able to say it's just bad for that we can survive a bad president. We can survive, a president you don't agree with, but they're not capable of saying, and if anytime my team loses, it's like it destroys a part of who I think I am. which is really the ultimate narcissistic attachment to politics.
Now, Donald Trump has seen his popularity rise after his indictment for falsifying business records. Now his defamation trial has begun as well, after columnist E. Jean Carroll brought a lawsuit following her accusation that the former president raped her in a New York department store. But if you read journals of conservative opinion, listen to interviews at the rallies, these charges, and others that may be coming down the pike from the aftermath of the vote in Georgia, have the president's supporters doubling down, not just shrugging and saying, oh, well, I may have to vote for him anyway. It doesn't seem to give them pause. In effect, it pushes down the accelerator pedal. Are they impenetrable?
As you would expect when people have fused their identity to someone else. You literally can't climb down out of that tree. You're not able to say, look, I am not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not me. When you've invested everything in this and you're like a cat climbing to the top of that tree, you can't get down afterward. And again, I think there is a narcissistic element of this. I can't be wrong. I've invested too much in this to be wrong. And so, I was thinking of an example recently I saw when Jordan Klepper was asked about his travels. Jordan Klepper, for people who don't know, he's a very funny guy. He's a very pleasant guy who goes to these MAGA rallies and he talks to the people that are there, and just gets them to say these kinds of outrageous things by just asking them questions. And he said that he knew the moment that all of this was irreversible is when he said to a woman, what would make you change your mind about Donald Trump being, involved in January 6th and all these investigations? He said, look, if he were trying to stop people from testifying, would you agree that he's got something on? So yes, that would do it. Absolutely. And he said, okay, he is doing that. He is trying to stop people from testifying, Mike Pence, Rudy Giuliani. And he said there was this long pause. And then she said, I don't care. Just said, I don't care. And I think that is where we are, that people have said, look, I've made this decision. I've floored the car. I'm all in on this because I don't know how to not do this. And I think, for some of I guess that was a long way of dancing around your central question, Ray, but I think for a lot of these people, they're not coming back. They're not going to say, okay, I was wrong about this. This is really toxic for America.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Tom Nichols talks about how the historic Fox News defamation settlement will affect the 2024 presidential race. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Interestingly, Fox News Channel seems to be figuring out exactly how it proceeds from this moment, where it's paying nearly $800 million in damages, or somebody's paying, insurance companies, whoever ends up paying, but somebody's going to pay $800 million for just spreading falsehoods after the November 2020 elections. Tucker Carlson is gone. It'll be interesting to see where he lands. You might say, well, this was a punishment for a lack of virtue, but it's not that clear that the ones that the system might judge the bad guys are going to lose in the end.
Yeah, look, I think any day that Tucker Carlson's not on the air is a good day for American democracy. I mean, he was really one of the most toxic, mendacious, cynical. I mean, one of the things I just wrote a piece for The Atlantic where I said, the really poisonous thing about Tucker Carlson is that he knew better. You can argue that there are people often made the case, for example, that Sean Hannity just isn't that bright, right? He kind of isn't, he's not a big thinker, but that Carlson really knew better. And he tailored, like he was titrating doses of a drug. He tailored that message to his audience specifically to keep himself on the air. But first of all, we don't know why he was canned. For all we know, there was a piece, I think Gabe Sherman in Vanity Fair said something to the effect of, Rupert Murdoch just didn't like all this religious talk at a heritage speech, like his ex-fiance and Tucker were too into the God talk. And he just said, okay, I'm 92, fire the guy. We don't know, but there's no reckoning going on here. They're going to pay, as you point out, over $750 million. And they're going to say, fine, we're going to put a patch on that burn and we're going to move on, because Fox's coverage has not changed 1 inch. They're not doing anything differently. It's like, we got caught, we did something wrong. Let's make sure we don't actually defame anybody now, but let's just keep pumping out the same sludge. So unfortunately, again, going back to the point earlier about the commodification of everything, Fox is a product. It's a profitable product. It's got a big audience, and they're going to keep selling those unhealthy burgers and milkshakes for as long as people buy them.
It is fascinating, though, that even after the revelations that involved internal memos, on-air personalities making it clear amongst themselves that they knew what they were saying was false, that some of it was even nuts, that they kept putting people on the air who would say crazy things. And they didn't, going back to civic virtue, think that this was a problem that sort of injures the American body, that injures the American corpus, the polity, us, that it was just another day of making the needle move, and they had no responsibility to make it stop.
Responsibility? What kind of crazy talk is that?
I know. I sound like Cotton Mather all of a sudden.
Yeah, right. It's like, no. Off to the dunking stool with you, my man. I think the other thing that's happened here, and again, Donald Trump was the avatar of this, but as much a symptom as he was a cause. And I say this all the time about a lot of elected GOPers, the inability to feel shame. Like, you would think that if you said, look, here's all my text messages where I'm clearly lying about everything. Look, nobody wants their text messages splattered out to the world. We all say things privately at work and to each other that are unflattering. But when you have a whole kind of narrative of, hey, I am lying to my stupid voters, like the Fox producer who said, we're probably a family network here, so I can't use the expression, but, kind of dumb, inbred, just the most brutal stuff. You would think that after that, you would say, I'm going to go spend more time with my family. But shame, they're incapable of shame. You have Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, throwing his arm around Marjorie Taylor Greene and saying, this is my pal. I feel, we were talking a minute ago about feeling old, Ray, but I feel old that poor, Wilbur Mills had to step down for, drunkenly splashing around in the tidal pool. He was the most powerful man in Washington for a while, chairman of Ways and Means. That's peanuts compared to saying, I'm the speaker and my speakership rests on the votes of Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. There is no ability to feel shame, remorse, regret, because we are a completely transactional society. The only question is, do I win or do I lose? Is it good for me or is it bad for me?
We've talked earlier in the conversation about content and gatekeepers and the sort of rails along the side of our information superhighway. One feature of it is that in all this gush of stuff, this great river of content that meanders toward the sea, there are fewer people making it. There are fewer people making a full-time living in journalism in 2023 than there were in 2000. And yet there's all this extra stuff. So just by mathematical rigidity, you just can't pay as much attention to each individual thing that you're doing because you're like Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate factory, watching stuff go by and shoving it down your blouse and in your mouth and all that. And it would be sort of ruefully funny if there wasn't so much riding on it. The stakes seem to be enormous, especially as the caucuses and the first primaries are now like 8 or 9 months away.
Yeah, let me sound like the annoying old grandpa here for a moment and say that part of the problem, this does go back to the narcissism problem, is that you have had now a few generations of people who have said, and I think this, by the way, explains a lot of the extremism in radio and television and other places, you've had more and more people saying at the tender age of 22 or 25 or 26, I should be a thought leader. I should be one of the creatives, right? You know, a word I love now that I picked it up from Mad Men. I should be one of the creatives. I should be writing content, 24 years old, and I should be explaining my very interesting life to everyone. And we cranked out a ton of these kind of college graduates who now are all battling for slices of this gigantic pie. But even as large as the bandwidth is, there's simply not enough room. And so you have to distinguish yourself. And how do you distinguish yourself in this, a term we don't use enough, in this attention economy? You have to stand out in some way. And if you can't stand out as a good example or by doing great work, then you stand out by being shocking, by being transgressive, by being just off the wall weird. And, again, Tucker Carlson's career is a wonderful cautionary tale in that sense, because the Tucker Carlson who emerges in the early 90s, the mid 90s when he starts writing, he's like, I'm a journalist. I care about the facts and I care about balance. And, I'm hearing all sides. And of course, he loses his gig at MSNBC, and then he goes on Crossfire and he loses his gig on Crossfire. And by the time he gets at Fox, he says, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. I have figured out how to stay atop of this pile. And that is by being as shocking and transgressive as possible. And there was a profile of him, and I linked it in my piece, profile in the New York Times, that he was determined to avoid what happened to him at MSNBC and CNN. And I think you have just a vast number of people who think that, my future is in writing, in journalism, I see it in my old profession of academia, where there are armies of unemployed PhDs saying, why, how come I'm not teaching in a university? Why did this happen to me? Why am I, and I don't know what to do about that other than to change. I won't even say lower expectations, to change expectations. Say there's a lot of things you can do in the world that don't involve being an actor, a writer, a producer, a professor, or whatever. Most people in the world don't work those jobs, but the competition has become so intense that it has driven people to try to grab their slice of the attention economy as aggressively as possible.
Well, Tom, it looks like the field for 2024 is rounding out the same way the field for 2020 did. Even though large numbers of voters would say, we don't want Trump-Biden too, it looks like, at least from the lights of today, that's what we're going to get. What does that tell us?
Well, I take the Biden voters with a grain of salt. I think it was my friend Jonathan Last who dug up the 1982 headline that said, most Republicans don't want Reagan to run again. This is something that just happens. There's always a certain amount of internal dissatisfaction of saying, I didn't get what I want from the guy, and he looks tired and he's going through a tough, second year of his term. But I think the interesting number in this is, of the people who don't want either candidate to run again, most of them, 40% or so, will vote for Joe Biden. And I think there's a lot of layers to this story. I wrote recently that I think some of the concern about Biden's age is really concerned about Kamala Harris. I like the fact that Biden's a low drama, kind of boring president. That's what I think the president ought to be. But, there's a big generational disconnect there. I argued, again, I've read, of course, because I write the Daily, I've written on all this stuff. I would argue that Trump-Biden is yet again another existential contest where democracy is going to be on the line.
I've read 1 million times. People say, oh, well, look, there's 335 million people in America. And really, is this the two best representatives that our country could come up with? And something just bugs me about that question, because I think it's the wrong question. You always have to vote for anybody you vote for, in part because of, hopefully, the virtues of that person, but also compared to who? That's always the next question. Who are they running against?
George Washington is not secretly hiding out there working in a mall in Wisconsin. And if only he could get into that's one of those myths that we comfort ourselves with. But also, I want to throw this back on the voters. The same people who don't show up for primaries, the same people that end up, where we pat ourselves on the back for a 60% turnout, say, well, who keeps giving us these terrible options? Well, what have you done to help narrow those options down? Where were you during the primaries? they're almost like kind of the annoying customers in a restaurant saying, well, you just tell me what's on the menu and then I'll complain about it when you serve it up. And I think that that's really, again, goes back to this issue of civic responsibility. That's just not a very civic approach. If you think you're getting bad quality candidates, you have to go and vote in primaries. You have to vote in local elections. You have to vote for the elections that create the farm teams that then produce more senior, senators and presidents and governors later on. And if you're not showing up for any of that, you can't complain later that you didn't get the candidates you want.
Tom Nichols is a staff writer at The Atlantic, the lead writer for The Atlantic's daily newsletter, and you should definitely take a look at that. He's the author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, and previously, The Death of Expertise. Tom, always good to talk to you.
Thanks, Ray. It was good to talk to you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. Special thanks to our programs team, Chris Dobson, Joy Koo, and Maya Kegley. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.